them inside a building, which means that the United States Navy, through using the patent pool devices built by Freescale, can actually send in agents to a crime scene with a very specific set of functions and monitor the position of each of the agents as they move towards the criminal event, which might be the kidnapping of those people or the murder of the balance of the passengers. And from a criminal point of view, or a criminal conspiracy point of view, what you want to do, and the Navy Yard would be an example, the Aurora Theatre would be another, Sandy Hook would be another, is to make sure that your Zigbee agents are in position so that A, they can execute the crime, which might be a kidnap or a killing, and B, that that component of the Zigbees which is devoted to triage is in position before the legitimate first responders arrive. And the great power of that is, if you're a corrupt or a manipulated triage team at a crime scene, you can make sure that the expert witnesses that would normally pop up in court to reveal what really happened at the crime scene are dead on departure. And let me give you an example. In the Pentagon, US Navy Command Center on 911, there was a British company doing the upgrade, and it was being commissioned that morning, and they were engaged in what are known as sabotage vulnerability testing. That is to determine whether or not the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center was protected against the kind of attack we saw on 911. On the Pentagon lawn, before the explosion, there was a triage team. And the triage team was deployed out of the Pentagon City Sheraton Hotel that overlooks the Pentagon lawn before the bomb went off. The Sheraton Pentagon City Hotel is part of a global chain of Sheraton hotels, and another member of that chain is in Port Douglas in Queensland, in Australia. And there was a man in a room, this is an allegation, on 911, who had a clear view through backhauled images from the cameras on the roof of the Pentagon City Hotel, looking down on the crime scene before the crime happened. It is very germane to the conspiracy to the attempt to overthrow the government of the United States on 911. And the man in the Port Douglas Hotel, Sheraton Port Douglas Hotel in Queensland, was your former president, Bill Clinton. Over to you.
Okay. Well, this is very, very bizarre, and what I'm trying to do here is record us on more than one device, just in case something happens here to this recording. They say it's going in and out. I am hearing you fine. Our recording at this end is fine. Again, I don't know what the outcome is going to be here. And I'm very sorry for this really bizarre situation, because live stream itself has never, in all the time I've been using it, gone down in this way. So I guess we're going in and out for people, and I apologize to the people that do hear what's going on here, and then we will put this up. It will go on YouTube, and it should be all of one piece by the time we get it out there. Back to the subject. What you're basically saying is, if I understand, is you're looking at the background of Freescale and the shareholders. But I think what I would be curious about, and I appreciate everything you've said. I think it's very accurate and has merit, but I'm wondering if such a public incident as this one is the way they would need to handle such a thing. There has been talk that, for example, that the 20, some were from Malaysia, some were from China, and apparently just one or two Americans that they may have had, perhaps there was something to do with the patent that Rothschild, who is the final owner of Freescale, we have traced it back, and the final owner of the company is, and I did a whole live stream on this with Mike Harris, who is a radio talk show host on rents.com, and he originally was worked at Motorola, or as a contractor and a consultant, and he actually went head to head with Rothschild to try to buy Freescale back at the time when it was a division of Motorola, seeing the merit in that company. Now, you can't, were involved in stealth technology. Now, the flight itself was on the way to China. It appears that because the individuals were Malaysian and Chinese, that there is a very high likelihood that that had been found, maybe even discovered at the Malaysian plant, that they then were going to fly to China and deliver to the Chinese, that the Americans did not want to see happen. Now, these are, again, speculations, but what I'm more curious at, and I understand the shareholder side of it, but that's very monetary. And this is a very, I think this is a very high-profile political event. And as we know with 9/11, there are monetary payoffs in the background, but the bottom line with 9/11 was the political implications. And what it really was about was sort of getting this ludicrous way of starting a sort of a witch hunt for Arab type people, as well as getting this whole war on terror going so that they could finance their war machine and get the war machine going into the Middle East even more so, and get Americans supposedly behind that. And of course we've gone into Iraq since then, and now they're in Syria, and as most people know, and I believe the next stop is Iran. So what do you have to say to all of that?
Well, that's a big run-on sentence with respect, Kerry. So let me just go back to the ownership of Freescale, and I'm just reading from Wikipedia. On September the 15th, 2006, $6 billion buyout by a consortium led by Blackstone Group and its co-investors Carlyle Group, TPG Capital, and Permira. And let me just stop there. So, as I've said, the Blackstone Group is the controlling shareholder in Freescale and is today. What's important about the Blackstone Group is it owned the mortgage on building number 7 on 911 and had doubled. So they doubled their money. The leveraged lease on building number 7 was of a value of around $400 million, and they collected an insurance payout of $800 million. So that was pretty lucrative. So we should understand who controls the Blackstone Group. Well, it's someone that Field and I managed to bounce out of his position at the Council on Foreign Relations, because I think it was around May of 2009 or something like that, we wrote to the chairman of the Blackstone Group, whose name is Peter Peterson. And Peter Peterson is a very interesting guy because he was head of research at Bell and Howell and supplied the Zapruder camera with which Mr. Zapruder recorded the assassination of JFK. And you probably guess, Gary, that in my life I don't believe there are any coincidences. Anyway, Blackstone, we wrote to them significantly after this acquisition of Freescale, where they control Freescale, and we wrote to Peter Peterson in his capacity of chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we said, we believe that you arranged the purchase of the mortgage on building number 7 prior to doubling the insurance on the building and profiting from the demolition. And would you believe 3 weeks later he resigned from his position on the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a major position, obviously. I mean, Hillary Clinton is in that group of people.
Right.
So now what Blackstone and these private equity groups are doing, they're doing what is called patent trolling. That is to say, they look at target companies that have the assets stripped out of them, and they have absolutely no compunction about driving companies like Freescale into bankruptcy, if that's what it takes. They certainly did that with Nortel, the Canadian company, because what is coughed up with a company that is over-leveraged, that is, it's borrowed too much money in comparison with the capital put up by its shareholders, is the lenders can manipulate the interest payments and penalties until the company can no longer afford to pay off the premium or the capital and goes bankrupt. And then, of course, it's sitting there with a pool of exceedingly valuable patents that can then be moved into a pool by the companies that historically have controlled patents since the 14th century. And those are the livery companies of the City of London. And now you mentioned the Rothschild, and this is very important because there's a Nathaniel Rothschild, who's the Prince of Wales, was a member of the Bullingdon Club in the mid-19th century, and interestingly turned up in Washington in 1860 at the beginning of the Civil War. And the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VIII, who became married to an American socialite by the name of Wallis Simpson, became for the love of this woman, and after abdicating, he became, instead of King Edward VIII, he became the Duke of Windsor, and one of the first journeys he made was to Germany, where he met with Hitler and was given a tour of the concentration camps, and then swanned around Europe and various other places with secrets to the Germans. Now, where am I going with this? All I'm saying is you're right in thinking that there's a Rothschild involvement, but I believe, with respect, you're wrong in thinking, that is to say, the Blackstone Group and those kind of people have much more understanding of how the international financial community can be manipulated in such a way that individuals or corporations can be stripped of their patents, and those patents can then be pooled by these companies in the United Kingdom and turned into weapon structures that control supply chains. So, for example, the global supply chain of patents for the Honourable Company of Air Pilots is in a position to put all of the decoy and drone maneuvers that we see with 911 and MH370 together, and that's what Field and I are working on, is that have been sucked into this phony search routine. To those people and their military personnel is that the global military chain of command that falls under the rubric of Defence Red Switch Net, Field mentioned to you in the last show, Serco, such that Serco is able to launch what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack on the chain of command of the United States that links your nominal president, Barack Obama, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the exercises taking place in Thailand during 370. Over to you.
Okay, well, that's very interesting to follow that trail, and no doubt about it. I would say that there apparently is in the news does get the ownership of these patents as a result of these four, I guess, employees of Freescale going missing. However, and it's logical to think of that it gets even more extensive than that, as you've just described, and goes in all kinds of directions. One, I think, needs to also keep your eye on the Carlyle Group, which is a major shareholder in Freescale, and there are others that are sort of detailed in some other articles that I've seen around here, having to do. But I am also very interested in this idea of stealth technology. In other words, the idea that a plane carrying individuals that work on stealth technology then is stealthily, supposedly disappearing, leads one to believe that there is that they may have been part of the operation, that indeed, at the very least, their technology was being used, and perhaps even a test being conducted, or something more diabolical, such as this test being done to make a statement, a political statement of a kind, to certain countries. And what the statement is not clear to me, but it occurs to me that this, as you say, I am one that doesn't believe in coincidences, and therefore there has to be something very very much of a synchronicity, having these individuals who work on this technology on this plane.
I think you're absolutely right, Kerry, and so a little rollback of the history clock, I think, is germane to this. So I've introduced, and what I, rather kicking myself, is I don't know why I didn't understand the implications of this network before, but about 10 days ago, while working on this analysis of Serco as a criminal organization, I put in Diego Garcia and Serco, and I found out incredibly that the British company was given the contract to upgrade the Air Force Satellite Control Network, AFSCN, the initials, on Diego Garcia and test it with the equivalent on Guam and Fort Belvoir in Washington and RAF Oak Hangar, to make sure that the upgrade allowed these functions or supported the functions of the Defense Red Switch Network, again, which is a concept that I'd only heard of about 10 days ago. And the total counterintelligence that we see associated with the Clinton regime, and that is the kind of people who look for the people who mean harm to the United States of America all the way up to an attempted coup d'etat, what I found to my horror was that these four levels, where you have the routine communications necessarily encrypted, but basically the routine that puts the politicians and the grunts and the frontline soldiers and their officers in communication with each other for any particular movement, special ops, any in the world. And then sitting above that is the immediate, which takes precedence over routine. So if you come in at the routine level, so traditionally, apparently you have a telephone keypad back in the 80s, and on the right-hand side they would be red keys, and you'd have at the bottom right R for routine, and the button above that would be I for immediate. The button above that is F for flash, and the button above that is FO, which is flash override. Now, obviously, the stuff in between is kind of irrelevant, but what's vitally important is the FO is the communication link that is set up at the request of the President of the United States and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But amazingly enough, in order to get into that FO layer or network, the President of the United States has to ask permission for the technicians that built and assemble and test the network, which turns out to be the British company Serco. So you've got this bizarre situation with, as those war games or exercises in Thailand were taking place, and I think one of them is called Cobra, some Gold Cobra or something like that, but they ran through the March the 8th abduction of MH370, meaning there were thousands of United States military personnel and Thai personnel and observers, including observers from Communist China, at an exercise where they would have been using the Defense Red Switch network with those different levels of priority, from routine, immediate, to flash and flash override, or override flash, flash override. Now, this is the classic structure for what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack, and just a little bit of history there. I hope it's not a diversion. The spy master for Queen Elizabeth I was a man called Francis Walsingham, or Sir Francis Walsingham. And he managed to get Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's half-sister, locked up. And she was communicating with her Spanish and French allies with an encrypted message smuggled out in the bung of a barrel of wine, presumably going into the castle where she was incarcerated, full, and coming back empty for some more beer or more wine, whatever the poor woman needed to while away her days prior to her execution. But inside the bung of the barrel would be would be notes encrypted. I don't know what level of encryption they had in those days, but they were intercepted by Sir Francis Walsingham, and then a postscript was added, forged, that indicated that Mary, Queen of Scots, was plotting to have her half-sister assassinated. So all Sir Francis Walsingham needed to do was expose the communications and say, look, she's plotting to kill the Queen. So she had her head chopped off. Exactly fast forward to 9/11 and this attack, you've got a British company, which actually, if you look at its roots, goes back to the spy master of the Elizabethan era. You've got this company, Serco, that is actually forging electronically or digitally the signature, not only of the plane MH370, but the participants in the exercise in Thailand, so that mingled stealthily amongst the legitimate actors who believe they're doing an exercise to protect, I don't know, Thailand against an eventual attack by China. You've got a bunch of agents who actually have evil thoughts and evil opportunities to hijack that plane and capture Freescale's leading team. I believe there were 8 Malays and 12 Chinese in the development of the Zigbee stealth technologies that allows you to put a criminal team mingled with regular folks to do a hit or a kidnap. Over to you.
Okay, yes, and that makes sense, I have to say, in light of this new information about the drill going on, that it would sort of play out that way. The question is, then, you're now talking about, the idea here that, I mean, it is bizarre to think that these individuals would have been kept alive while the rest, we wonder what happened to the rest of the people on board. You understand? Yes. And I don't know if you've thought down that road at all. Of course, there are different scenarios that could be going on there. Any thoughts?
Well, I think the general philosophy of these, the body count is irrelevant. What they want to do is camouflage a crime. So in any group, you have high-value targets and the expendables, including the Zigbee agents who go into the crime scene, who, according to my analysis of Field's sister, she has created with Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick in the 90s, an increase in the prison population of the United States of America of around 1 million, absolutely staggering numbers, and privatized the prison system to companies like Wackenhut, which has been bought by G4S, which works with Serco. Now, what that means is those individuals who are laundered, if that's the right word, through the prison system, can be brought out on furlough or parole to do a hit in another country, and then flown back into the prison system, and they basically back in time for lunch or dinner with a nearly perfect alibi. And this is the ultimate of stealth technology. You take people, you process them either with a surgical or a chemical or a psychological lobotomy of the type practiced at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Insane in Washington, just across the east of the Potomac River from the Pentagon attack. And you have, in its heyday, you had 8,000 patients, a significant number. In fact, there were 100,000 lobotomies, surgical lobotomies, done at that hospital. And I'm not enough of an expert, but the product of a lobotomy, as I understand it, is a robot with various levels of functionality, but certainly not anything like approaching a normal human being, that presumably can be rewarded and punished so that it ends up, when I don't like using the word it, but basically the soul of this creature has departed. So now you've got what is nominally a human being with a brain with a very limited capacity to empathize with its victims, that you can take out of the prison or the medical hospital, deploy to a crime scene, such as Sandy Hook, to do hits. No positive feedback, given theoretically those children at Sandy Hook had up to 11 bullets in their head from an AR-15, which I don't think leaves much of a hit. And basically, they're back in jail, which might be the Ghana Correctional Institute, half a mile from the school, having lunch with the perfect alibi. So we've got this hideous combination of stealth technology embedded in the military command structure of the United States of America, controlled by a British company which is currently under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office for illegally tagging non-existent, dead, or back in jail or foreign-based prisoners, which creates a virtual force for any kind of crime that you care to imagine. Or am I digressing, or do you think that makes sense?
Okay, well, yes. I mean, I do hear what you're saying, and you're kind of referring to the individuals or the mind control, what I would call the mind control of the individuals as a form, and then the use of them as sorts of, diabolical super soldiers or something even more low level than that.
Zombies.
Yeah. Okay. As a kind of stealth technology, but we're also referring to a very specific software that allows for stealth technology that would allow for the plane itself to be flying, for example, for 5 hours without, even though the ping apparently was being heard, the plane itself was supposedly not seen.
I can talk to that if you wish.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then why don't you talk to that?
Okay. So I'd like to introduce your listeners to a concept called free flight technology that was sponsored by the International Civil Aviation Organization based in Montreal. And the idea of free flight technology is to detach a plane from ground-based air traffic control with its conventional towers. So when the plane reaches its cruising altitude, which is normally not so busy as the immediate vicinity around an airport, where obviously a lot of contextual decisions have to be made by pilots based on their visual observations of what their neighbors are doing, adjacent aircraft, weather balloons, birds, etc., etc. Up at cruising altitude of the kind reached by MH370, there's not a lot of activity. And so what the people in Montreal did, and I'll come to their sponsors in a minute, which I believe is part of a criminal organization, is they said, wouldn't it be interesting if we could use adjacent aircraft to do the positioning of any one of their members in at cruising altitude, so that the planes, instead of being controlled by air traffic control from the ground, are controlled by a swarm of, if you will, aerial Zigbees, each using precise synchronized timing signals and satellites and the most accurate clock in the world, which is the National Physical Laboratory clock in the custody of Serco, to position themselves. Now, when that plane had its transponders and ACARS systems switched off, it is my belief that it wasn't so much the Inmarsat satellite that was receiving a ping from the engines, the Rolls-Royce Trent engines of the Boeing 777-200 of MH370. It's actually the Inmarsat satellite was sending pings to that aircraft for that part of the Boeing that had been illegally modified to receive it. And that was what in communications terms is an interrogation ping, to say, where are you? And stand by for a new waypoint. And Inmarsat, I believe, is an integral part of the conspiracy for the abduction of MH370. It's a British company with some very dodgy directors, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the Inmarsat would then have pretended that it was receiving passively a ping from the engines, and then it pretended that no other satellite in that area, and the space is now swarming with satellites, both civilian and military, no other satellite received that ping, albeit they've been designed for signals intelligence to monitor everything that's communicated. And they said the only satellite to receive the last ping was the Inmarsat satellite in geostationary orbit directly above Diego Garcia. And therefore they weren't able to triangulate, which is absolute garbage. So they were forced to use Doppler effect analysis, which is a phony baloney way of saying, well, when something moves towards you, blowing its whistle, it has a different frequency to when it's moving away from you. And that you can, by the different frequency, measure the speed of the vehicle. So what they said is that they were able to measure the speed, but in fact, I believe they were lying. I think they were operating what effectively is a homing beacon directly above Diego Garcia and guiding the plane towards Diego Garcia in what the International Civil Aviation Organization would call free flight mode. That is to say, detached from ground traffic control or air traffic control and flown entirely by a cooperative network of aerial Zigbees. Is that clear?
Yes, and very well put together. I do want to draw people's attention. I have on the front page of Camelot and have had for a while this article by Chip Tatum that does outline who Inmarsat is owned by and where it traces back. This is the company that I was explaining, that it goes back to Harbinger Capital that used to be called Zapata Corporation, that is owned by Bush Sr. when you trace it all the way back.
Yes, and we can keep going away at those ownership situations. When I hear people quite often, we live unfortunately in a very socialized economy up here in Canada that has been taught from the mother's breast that large corporations and Americans are nasty people. Now, I worked in two large corporations. One is the Central Electricity Generating Board that at its time employed 200,000 people. And then this company, Schlumberger, which is the world leader in data technology for the oil industry. And when I hear this notion that a large corporation are psychopathic, I just look at people and shake my head, because I never met anyone, certainly from my engineering and scientific background, in either the electricity board or the Schlumberger, who didn't want to do the best they could professionally and technically, and satisfy their clients. And in the case of the electricity board, the client is the people who buy electricity. Anyway, I digress. When someone tells me, and I'm not pointing at you, Kerry, that Bush owns X company, I'm saying that within a company, and I used to study corporate organizations, you have the rank and file workers who get promoted up to generally a level of executive management, and then sitting above them you have a board of directors who are elected by the major shareholders. And in today's major corporations, the major shareholders of the institutional shareholders of major corporations are the big institutional pension fund. For example, the biggest shareholder in Boeing is the TIAA-CREF, the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association College Retirement Equity Fund, which manages the pension funds of educators such as Barack Obama and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn of the Weather Terrorist Underground Organization, and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, who taught at Georgetown University. So TIAA-CREF was the biggest institutional shareholder in Boeing when the company was forced to move its headquarters from Washington State to Chicago, where its offices were commissioned on 911. So I'm just going off at a tangent there about ownership of major corporations. Now, if there is one director on a board of directors who can be entrapped, and we've talked about honey traps or honey pots, and there are two kinds of honey pots. There's the sexual honey pot, which I think basically everyone understands, and the smartest place to set sexual honey pots are 4-star and 5-star hotels of the kind that Bill Clinton was staying in Port Douglas in Queensland on the morning of 9/11. Now, whether Bill Clinton has been entrapped sexually, I don't know, but it's very obvious if you want to control the Bill Clinton community through the Defense Red Switch network, an obvious target would be people who are moving up the promotional ladder who might one day end up at number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or 24 Sussex Drive, which is the equivalent in Canada, or your 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, where whatever Obama's background is, if he can be caught in a honey trap as a young person, maybe a boy in Jakarta, or in the Lahore Hotel, you own the occupant or incumbent in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, when that applies to the directors of these companies, let's go to Inmarsat. One of the directors, a woman of Inmarsat, is also a director of Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia. And Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia is very interesting because it's the principal developer of interceptor software for incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's a vital company to provide the software that should have prevented the attack of 9/11, which theoretically was planned by a long-bearded guy in a cave in Afghanistan with a couple of walkie-talkies on a dialysis machine that brought America to its knees. And I just look at that and I shake my head and said, how in the world can Americans, who are just as bright as Canadians and Brits and Australians, imagine that they lost the most important military strategic asset in the arsenal of the United States on 9/11, and none of them, including the mainstream media, have asked the question, who replaced those key functions? Because, Kerry, you lost on the morning of 9/11, as observed, I believe, by Bill Clinton in his hotel in Port Douglas in Queensland, you lost the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. That's the link between the President of the United States and US Navy military assets around the world, which would be the only thing that would prevent, for example, China from successfully invading Taiwan. And no American that I've met, well, a few exceptions like Phil McConnell, have said to themselves, including the military people, well, who in the world would have been able to profit at least in the chain of command, from the removal of the US Navy Command Center and its transfer to X. Well, I believe I know who it was transferred to, and it was transferred to the livery companies of the City of London, in particular the Honourable Company of Master Mariners. But perhaps, that's a digression. But we're not asked. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. And well, that's very interesting. And I'm not surprised by that sort of trail. But yeah, and all of what you say is very logical. I can say that following out those trails through the company, owners, the stockholders, the major stockholders, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, you're getting into a level of detail that few people do, but one cannot either sort of avoid the sort of links to the CIA and also to Bush Sr. that were indicated as part of Inmarsat and what is, Zapata Corporation, what became Harbinger either. So,
Right.
I think that these things are in addition to rather than either or. But
Yes.
but certainly these are important points. There are reasons that you can trace some of the other false flags. I believe Sandy Hook is one of them that I ran down with a remote viewer, who I shall not name, that indicate that the City of London also was involved in that, and that there was some very strong symbolism indicating that there were some banking maneuvers going on associated with Sandy Hook that most people don't follow out, but were shown to me that I found very fascinating, and so on. So there does seem to be, even in the Boston bombing, apparently some symbolism behind the scenes that has to do with when we say City of London, I think in terms of the Rothschild New World Order, because what we have is our factions, as I understand it, and you can certainly weigh in on this, which have to do with Bush Sr. running a cabal that tries to be in charge of the United States, while the Rothschild side of the New World Order, and they have a sort of competition between them as to who's going to run what. And this is where some of the symbolism of these false flags, it comes out in these kinds of maneuvers that have to do with the City of London trying to take over things and control of America, or in essence bring America back under its fold. What I've been told is that in order for the New World Order to succeed, at least as it's envisioned by the Rothschild side of things, that that America has to be taken down, and that includes financially. And so this is where Bush Sr. and Rothschilds are often working at cross purposes, even though their ultimate aim is the same thing, which is a New World Order. But I guess, from what I understand, it depends who's going to run that New World Order. Thoughts?
Well, yeah, and I can't apologize for the complexity here, because there's hundreds of years of history intertwined where powerful organizations, and let me just identify one extraordinarily powerful organization, the British East India Company, or the Honourable Company, British East India Company, in its time, and it got its chartered papers in 1600, from 1601, from Queen Elizabeth I, was the most powerful corporation, given inflation, that the world has ever seen. It had ships, the fastest ships, faster than the Royal Navy, better armed than the Royal Navy, and it had, in the 19th century, 200,000 men under arms. And Queen Victoria tried to dismantle it and take its assets and basically share them out amongst what we would now recognize as Her Majesty's forces, armed forces. And the sappers and miners of the British East India Company were absorbed into the regular British Army. And that company was given the right to trade into China and India, tea mainly in China, and tea mainly in India, and opium in China. And its descendants, if you will, and these are the very powerful families that include the Rothschilds and the Astors, as in the Waldorf Astoria in New York. These people, they're basically built their wealth on the opium trade. And they were in a powerful enough position, actually, to finance the opium wars of the 19th century. In the 19th century, the Port of London would sometimes have as many as 20,000 ships. That is, it was the hub of world trade. In the 20th century, the powers that be, these very powerful livery companies, and there's 109 today, the latest one being the Worshipful Company of Educators, which would be affiliated to people like Obama and his wife, and the leaders of the weather terrorist underground organization, Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, who are the mentors of Obama. These people basically now control the supply chains of the 109 livery companies, one of which is the Honourable Company of Air Pilots that just changed its name. But the Honourable Company of Air Pilots has been intimately involved with all major weapons development that are delivered by air, including the technology of free flight that was used to disappear MH370 as it reached cruising altitude and linked up at that waypoint north of Malaysia with the Singapore Airlines 68, and then flew on an hourly homing interrogation ping from the Inmarsat satellite until it was over Diego Garcia, where the SIA 68 continued on to Portugal, and MH370 was peeled off for its Category 3C landing on the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot and landed on the island, where the plane was refueled. And my theory is, during the next 72 hours, and it's very interesting because our research team has discovered that on the 8th of March of 2014, when the plane was disappeared, for the next 72 hours, the departures from Diego Garcia were shut down. Now, isn't that interesting? Because now, when it says on the Facebook that there's a 72-hour shutdown of aircraft departing, that doesn't prove that no aircraft left in that next 72 hours. So on the hypothesis side, it is my belief that the 20 experts in Zigbee stealth technology with free-scale semiconductors were flown to their original destination in Beijing and probably didn't meet with this individual, and I'll come to that individual in a minute. I think they would probably have been taken to the Tianjin fabrication plant for free-scale semiconductors that Kerry was set up in 1992. So I, as a Brit, with no particular professional background in counterintelligence, would say, why would you have a company that's on the cutting edge for decades on the development of stealth semiconductor technology of the kind needed by the B-2 stealth bomber? Why would you set up a fabrication plant in Tianjin in China, which is run by the People's Liberation Army? And then I thought
Actually, I want to just stop you there because, yes, I mean, this is perplexing, and this is part of what I discussed with Mike Harris, who knows and was present during the time when Motorola was sold off to China, or at least a good portion of it, and that it was, in essence, taken down, and he talks about that at length. So I just want to interject that. There is something going on with that. What it is, I do not understand. It's not clear to me. So if you can make that clear.
Well, I think I can. So going back to the British East India Company, the most powerful company the world has ever seen, given its time period. Basically, Queen Victoria and her advisors tried to dismantle it. But it's a bit like after the Second World War, dismantling the operation of the Nazis with British intelligence and American intelligence in bringing, through Operation Paperclip, camp commandants from the concentration camps and leading German rocket scientists into the United States to form the basis of the CIA. It's exceedingly difficult to dismantle these networks, whether they're corrupt or not, because the network, by its very nature, is invisible, and its ties and internal obligations and responsibilities are beyond the ken of the average person in the street. They didn't know it ever existed, let alone it's continued to exist. So let me just go back to the fabrication plant in China. So my thesis would be, when the British East India Company, albeit Queen Victoria had attempted to dissolve it, was running the opium trade into China, the great British fortunes and associated American fortunes were built on the opium trade by the number one drug dealing, trafficking and money laundering bank in the world, which is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, which about a year ago paid $1.9 billion fine to Christine Marcy Field's sister's Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund to keep its directors out of jail or to be treated as members of a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization in respect of money laundering through the Mexican drug cartels. So between 1865 in London, at the height of the opium trade, and the payment of the fine within this last year of $1.9 billion to Christine Marcy's fund, I ask you, what's changed? I mean, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, unlike the people, the tellers, who I'm sure are thoroughly reliable and decent people, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank chartered an armored personnel carrier to move the banknotes across the border into Mexico to pay off the Mexican drug cartels that have got a nasty habit of decapitating people in large numbers or hanging them off bridges. So the problem is with this stealth technology, and I'm coming to it, if I'm right in saying that the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation is continued to engage in arms and drug and white slave traffic and can stay out of jail by paying protection money to Christine Marcy's Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, why wouldn't it finance the development of a stealth technology fabrication plant in Tianjin for the People's Liberation Army, where, because there's a limited number of people who can reverse engineer these kind of semiconductors, they needed a complete team, and it's unheard of, because I used to fly at a fairly high level in Schlumberger on a plane, and in Schlumberger you never put more than 2 or 3 high-value people on the same plane, for obvious reasons. Why would Freescale have put 20 of these very high-value people on the same plane? And did they know that each other was on, because it would be easy to book them independently, and you don't necessarily, if you talk to someone 3 rows behind in a second seat, it's only perhaps when you arrive on Diego Garcia and various people are selected out of that 229 passenger load, and you find out that 20 of your colleagues in this patent technology stealth world had all been abducted together. So it's not at all obvious they knew they were going together as a delegation, and that would be a characteristic of a Zigbee kidnapping, that you don't tell everyone exactly what you're doing. Anyway, going back to the fabrication plant. Now, what I believe we can now prove at Able Danger is that the defense red switch network that operates between the routine, immediate flash and flash override protocols has been compromised by the British company Circuit. That is to say, when people in the chain of command, like the 2 platoons associated with the assassination of Pat Tillman, when they receive a command through this defense red switch network, the officers and men and women receiving the command believe that it's coming from a legitimate source because it's coming through an encrypted network. What they don't realize is that that network has been compromised by Serco, and it can, either in the name or with efficient actors, mimic the voice of none other than Barry Spatero or Barack Obama. Now, if I'm the officer of a platoon that's been split up from another platoon in Afghanistan, and I've got one of the Tillman brothers in one of the platoons and another in another, Pat Tillman, and suddenly platoon 1 is sent off on the road to Khost, and platoon 2 goes into a canyon to clean out a Taliban nest in a village, and then for some amazing reason, the platoon that's carrying a helicopter that's broken down or something like that turns around, comes back into the canyon, and the two platoons start shooting at each other, and someone puts a short burst 3 bullets into the forehead of Pat Tillman, which wouldn't leave much of his head. That was a hit. And it was a hit organized by compromising the Defense Red Switch network, which links the entire United States command structure with its allies around the world, including the United Kingdom, including Canada, including Malaysia, and including Thailand, as per the exercise. So,
okay, but yeah, and I appreciate all of that. The only thing is, I'm still back at this this plant in China.
Okay.
And I'm still trying to kind of put that piece in its place.
Okay, let me give you a very important clue.
Okay.
In December of 1997, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who would be a principal player at the flash override level of the Defense Red Switch Network, his name was John Shalikashvili. He was the son of Dmitry Shalikashvili, who was a major in the Waffen-SS in the Second World War, who lied about his past to get into the United States. John Shalikashvili arrives in the United States and is educated in Illinois and gets promoted, I believe, by British intelligence to the point where he becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reporting to the chief the Commander-in-Chief, Bill Clinton. Unbelievably, in 1997, Bill Clinton sends the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili, to Beijing to give a presentation to the People's Liberation Army University in Beijing. And from memory, excuse me if I don't get the words exactly right, at the end of that presentation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says to the audience, presumably of the highest ranking generals in the People's Liberation Army, "My president has instructed me before leaving here to leave details with you of all America's weapons programs." Now, I don't know what you think about that, but I'm a Brit, and if I sensed, and I have relatives in the British Army, when such an individual, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, having said that, and its public statement, came back to the United States, I believe he and his president of the time should have been arrested and put in front of a military tribunal, because that's treason. Thousands of American soldiers have died as a result of the transfer of technology by the Clintons and the late John Shalikashvili to the Communist People's Liberation Army in Beijing.
Yes. Okay.
And one of the things that was created in part of that environment is the transfer of the patent technologies related to stealth bombing that has gone to the fabrication plant in Tianjin province.
Okay, so yes, and I'm aware of that past with the Clintons, and that has been bothering me and in association with this, actually. But I see where you're going. I mean, this is very fascinating, and I want to know, again, sort of why. In other words, what is the purpose of this link up with a supposed sort of certainly an enemy on some level, and I understand on the highest level that these people work together, okay, but on this lower level that we're talking about here, it does seem to be a contradiction. And, you know, and I've had, I mean, there's other information out there with, you know, things in sort of, I think the harbor in Southern California being sold off, lots of land, lots of important land being sold off to the Chinese, buildings and things of that nature. In other words, there does seem to be a steady, I don't know, encroachment by the Chinese in America, and I'm trying to figure out what we're talking about here.
Well, let me back up to this role that the United Kingdom has had in the development of China, and communist China specifically. And remember, the first communist, at least the theoretical communist, would be Karl Marx, who was groomed and trained and employed and hired and rewarded in the United Kingdom. So the Communist Manifesto of 1848, you know, it's got some extraordinary lines in it. One of them is confiscate the property of your enemies. Another, not in the Communist Manifesto, is a statement by Karl Marx: abolish the family. Even the most radical flare up the infamous suggestion of the communists. So what you see in the communist, which I believe was entirely orchestrated out of the United Kingdom as an action-reaction problem type thing,
right,
is that they could create this monster of communism and give it a name, a bit like Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and then say the free world has to arm and prepare for an attack by the communists. But there's a deeper bond, I mean, and this would be my theory, and it comes back to this idea of if you can take a human being and either surgically, chemically, or psychologically lobotomize them at any level, that is to say, the psychological lobotomy might be the entrapment of a Bill Clinton or a Hillary Clinton at a young age when hormones are raging, to the extent that it is my understanding that while on a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, Bill Clinton was kicked out of the university for rape in 1969. Now, your readers and researchers are welcome to check that, but my understanding is after being kicked out of Oxford, and I think also there was allegations of drug dealing, Clinton didn't come back to the United States, he went to Moscow. And in Moscow, he met with senior people from the KGB, and apparently they discussed, amongst other things, how much information could be pumped out of John McCain at the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam. So coming back to, is there, and I suppose I put that just out there as a question, I think it's almost rhetorical, is there a mechanism by which the average human being, male or female, can be entrapped sexually at an early enough age such that they would rather die than risk exposure of the evidence of what they did, let's say hypothetically, to a child? And alarmingly, I'm afraid, there are organizations around the world, including SOS Children's Villages, which is, I believe, in 143 countries, and the Angel Tree Network associated with the Prison Fellowship Program, where the children associated with orphans during civil wars, incredible cruelties and genocides, where the children are witnessed something almost beyond imagination being done to their parents, and then they're captured, turned into child soldiers, run through camps and processed. And at the end of that time, eventually they become teenagers, and then they become regular people in society, but with a past that perhaps they'd rather die than have revealed. Now, is someone like Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Michelle Obama, and I'm going to come to a trip, a very important trip that Michelle Obama made recently, are they immune to that kind of entrapment and blackmail and extortion? And the answer, I think, is no. Now, going back to the Tianjin fabrication plant, Michelle Obama is an intellectual property lawyer, and she worked from 1988 to 1991 at the law firm of Sidley Austin in Chicago, whose clients include Airbus, the great competitor to Boeing, of course. And her mentor at Sidley Austin was a woman by the name of Bernardine Dawn, who's a psychopath, the leader of the Weather Underground organization. And she was employed, Bernardine Dawn, for 4 years by Sidley Austin to groom women interns. Now, you're a woman, Kerry. I don't know if you can imagine what grooming by Bernardine Dawn would be like, but I think it would test your moral fortitude. Because from 1984 to 1988, it would appear that Bernardine Dawn, the psychopath, the woman who arranged the bombing of the Pentagon in 1972, had access to the bright young women that came to a very illustrious law firm, and would have been in a position to entrap them, I believe, in situations where subsequently, whatever careers they followed, they were controlled by the groomers and the entrapment specialists in Chicago. Now, Michelle Obama in 1991 goes to Washington with a team of Sidley Austin lawyers representing 3 clients. One is Union Carbide in the aftermath of the sabotage of the Bhopal plant, where 47 tons of water was pumped into a bath of methyl isocyanate, killed 8,000 people in that area and seriously injured 270,000. And the first tort lawyer to arrive to adjust the claims was a Sidley Austin lawyer called Sir Ian Percival, but I digress. Another client was AT&T, which built the original technology for the Defense Red Switch network for continuity of government. And the other outfit was PBS, Public Broadcasting, which does the propaganda, as I see it, for the BBC. Fast forward to the aftermath of the disappearance of MH370. Lo and behold, the Sidley Austin intellectual property lawyer, who was disbarred, as I understand it, in 91 or 92, books in with her mother and her friends and cronies and the 2 girls into the Westin Hotel in Beijing, which was the destination for the Freescale semiconductor team prior to going on to wherever they were going to. And apparently the Chinese staff of the Westin Hotel, which is run by the Starwood Group, which also ran the Pentagon City Hotel and the hotel in Queensland where Bill Clinton was on the morning of 9/11, the Starwood Hotel Westin chain housed this woman and her cronies, and apparently the staff in that hotel were going around the bend because the woman, I don't know how that quite translates into American, she's got no class. And her mother has even less. So they were shouting at the staff, they were embarrassing themselves, they were making unreasonable demands, and they were acting according to, I guess, type, if you will. But the interesting thing for me is you've got Sidley Austin lawyer, specializes in intellectual property, with a very interesting challenge for the United States of America and Communist China, which is what to do with the intellectual property associated with the disappearing team of Freescale semiconductors and the reverse engineering going on in the Tianjin fabrication plant. And I suggest to you that Michelle Obama was negotiating a trade-off. The denouement, I don't know what it is, but I think it's going to be pretty shattering for world history. I believe that Michelle Obama was acting unlawfully in negotiating with the highest level in the Chinese People's Liberation Army on an exchange of technologies that will one day lead to the potential for a stealth attack on the United States of America with Chinese weapons. Over to you.
Okay, well, yeah, that does make sense, as you have outlined it. I can say, though, that it actually sounds because you're making it as though, in a sense, they're dealing with a disappearance of a plane that they are actually orchestrating. So her being there to negotiate wasn't an accident. Obviously, it would have been planned.
Yes.
And it would also indicate that, not sure, but the way you're sort of painting this picture is that these individuals, these 20 scientists in essence, are probably dead, at least from the point of view of the way, this negotiation would have taken place, in theory. But
I think I would say there would be a catch-22. I would say the 20 scientists are dead for all intents and purposes in the public view,
okay.
But I believe they may still be alive and converted, perhaps given new identities, to work at that fabrication plant on reverse engineering the Freescale semiconductor chips. Over to you.
Okay, yeah, because that's the only thing that sort of remains. Now, there is another, and thank you for all of that. And your researchers and your research is really stellar. And I appreciate you taking all the time to go through all of that. And I believe it's being recorded very well here, in spite of the intermittent in and out of the audio for the public. We will get this out there regardless. But the question I have is something nobody seems to be talking about, but I'm curious about. What about the other passengers? Has anyone looked at that list and found anyone else of special note besides these scientists that everyone has already pinpointed? And have any of your researchers gone down that road? Because it is possible that there are some other players in this game that were part of, the team on board.
I think, that's a very interesting observation, Kerry, because it comes back to this dog that didn't bark. I mean, why haven't they published the names of the 229 passengers so that the public at large, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, an informed public will make the right decision. I can't answer that. I don't know who the 209 passengers, other than apparently this guy Philip Woods, who's an IBM, I don't know if he's an executive or a manager or a technical guy, the fellow who takes the iPad out of his rectum. Most amazing character, I think. But the other 208 at the moment, for the public at large, are apparently anonymous. The entire focus is that woman, Sarah B. Bajk, who's the girlfriend of Philip Woods, said, we think we're being misled, but she didn't actually pursue that. But what I found bizarre about that BBC interview with her, if on the Facebook this guy, her boyfriend, says, I took the da-da-da and etc., she doesn't mention that. She just claims to be the girlfriend of the man, and she really believes that it's the governments are playing with the people's minds, but she doesn't pursue it. So I think that's a very valid question. Why wouldn't they publish it? Well, maybe there are some extremely high valuable people on the other 209, and they're terrified that those individuals, once their names are published, would reveal some of the things that I believe the 20 Freescale people do, that it actually leads back to the compromising of the most important strategic asset in the arsenal of the United States of America and its allies, which is the defense red switch network. Over to you.
Okay, well, you're saying the compromising of that, but there's also the stealth technology itself, which seems to be part of this scenario that is going to be compromised.
Yes, let me just say that. So we don't know what those 20 people had in their hand luggage. Remember, these semiconductor devices are tiny. To both fabricate them, design them and fabricate them, you need an extraordinary specialized technology, immensely expensive. And to reverse engineer them, I believe you need some extremely powerful technology, and I presume that that's in the fabrication plant in Tianjin.
Well,
but the actual size of the device to be stolen, you could actually insert as a subcutaneous chip in the skin of the web of your hand.
Okay, but there's another part to this story that involves another part of the technology that that had just been in the news, apparently. That Freescale Semiconductor had just sort of created this chip, and because I'm not very technical, I don't quite know how to phrase this, so I might be getting this wrong. But my understanding of what I heard and what I read is that the chip that they had just patented and put out there, basically, is a chip that is sort of like a centralizing chip, if I understand this correctly, that is able to operate all sorts of other chips and devices. In other words, are you familiar with that aspect of the story?
You know what? I'm actually looking at the name of the chip, and it's called Kinetis, Kinetis, and this isn't my immediate area, except that I've had a general background in science and technology and artificial intelligence, so I think I understand what they're going. But let me just, may I read it? It's it's a rather technical description, but anyway, I'll do my best. On the 26th of February 2013, Freescale Semiconductor announced the creation of the world's smallest, in brackets by size, ARM-powered chip, the Kinetis KLO2, and very interestingly, Kerry, KL stands for Kuala Lumpur, because that's where it was designed, apparently. KLO2 measures 1.9 by 2 millimeters, so it's tiny, and is a full microcontroller unit, MCU, meaning the chip sports a processor, RAM, ROM, clock, and I/O control unit. One application that Freescale says the chips could be used for is swallowable computers. Freescale already works with a variety of health and wellness customers. The new chip was on display at Embedded World in Nuremberg, Germany from February 26th to 28th, 2013. Now,
okay,
my interpretation...
let me just stop you right there, because I am also looking at an article, but you've got the year wrong. It was February, you've got the date right, but it was 2014.
Okay, well, it says on the Wikipedia it's 2013, so maybe that's a Wikipedia mistake.
Yeah, I'm looking at CNET, a CNET article, and they're very computer literate over at CNET, so I would be very surprised if this information was wrong, according to this at least. Okay,
but you see, and I have years in product development in various spheres, when they announce the release of a particular item, it will have been debugged, it will have been modified. Its antecedents, including the patent devices that are integral to this new launch, will go back years, if not decades.
Sure.
So the important thing about Freescale Semiconductors, in being able to produce this extraordinary piece of technology, the technologies that would have been required as precursors were already in place and already being used and already being manufactured. So it's not a sudden discontinuous appearance where they suddenly put on a hijacking, if you will, to get the employees that are a principal part of it. Now, where I'm going with that is what I've described there is the very core, and used it as a sort of central management function. This is the essence of Zigbee precise positioning of assets which might be human or they might be weapons. Let's say a dirty nuke, a suitcase nuke, right, could have one of these chips attached to it, right, in the briefcase, meaning that everyone with access to that defense red switch network at the appropriate level would know exactly where the dirty nuke was, whether it was in Chicago Hotel or the Astoria, Waldorf Astoria in New York, or in the Westin Hotel in Beijing in the baggage of Michelle Obama. Now, from the point of view of the geostrategic level here is what you're doing, what we're dealing with, I believe, Kerry, is a racketeering, influence, and criminal organization. It's not terrorist, it's not Satanist, it's not Illuminati, it's Jews. It's a criminal organization that we give too much credit for when we say they're terrorists. Because what we're implying there, yes, of course they're terrifying, but we're implying that there are organizations that just exist in this loosely defined umbrella of terrorism, which you can attach the name Al-Qaeda or the Taliban and then spook the American public into looking for terrorists under the bed, if you will, instead of using the law that already exists in the United States of treating these kind of structures as racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization, where membership is a crime. And so you don't have to prove that these individuals killed someone. All you need to do is prove that they are members of a racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization. And if the RICO actually killed people, you throw the members into jail for murder for hire. So where am I going with that? What I guess I'm basically saying is that people equipped with these kind of technologies can bring stealthily a portfolio of weapons into the gates, inside the gates of Washington, D.C., and say to the senators and the congressmen, we have weapons that involve, for example, a sabotage spore powder with anthrax bacteria. So you've got these little senators and congressmen, I don't mean in a pejorative or, patronizing sense. You've got people who maybe had a job working in a union as a secretary, who've been elected and been sent to Washington to represent their constituents' interest, and they sit as congressmen or senators and maybe even graduate into the White House. But they have absolutely no structure and training to deal with the kind of second-based decision-making as should we concede something over here in order to avoid having a dirty nuke attack in Washington, D.C. And if you look at people like Obama, and I'm not saying that I or you would be any the better, it's so much out of our experience. All the conspirators or the crime groups need to do is to say meaningfully and credibly, we can attack you with letters containing anthrax. Now, what do? Do you roll over? You don't know who your attackers are. You do know that suddenly, in spite of the billions of dollars of counterintelligence and technology, you've got letters with anthrax powders arriving through the United States Post Office and killing people. So I believe what we've got here is an organization engaged in extortion and intimidation using modern technologies where they've literally captured private companies owned by shareholders and converted their patents and intellectual property into weapons that they can store and conceal and camouflage and use to threaten and obtain concessions from the public at large anytime, anywhere, including a Boeing 777-200 that was captured from Malaysian Airlines. Over to you.
Okay. Yes, very well said. I'm actually still looking at this little processor, which is, it was released, or at least the news was released, the 25th of February. And what it was is that this particular thing was, it's called the Kinetis KLO3 MCU. It's 15% smaller than its predecessor and 35% smaller than the competitive offerings, according to the Freescale people, and is supposed to be about the size of the dimple in a golf ball, is how it's described. But it is a microcontroller, and it seems to me that this release that was, I guess, very public, because it's all over the internet. You know, you just start a search and you see article after article. What it appears is that again, if you don't believe in coincidences, the date of that release and the date of this happening are so close together that that it would appear there's something going on with that. In other
I
words,
agree.
that we can't ignore that either. So, I appreciate what you're saying about the extortion side of things. I'm not sure. I think that for example, the artificial intelligence, which this really hints at being a kind of almost a nanotech controller of sorts. They call it a microcontroller. Meaning, what does it control? It can control, who knows? I mean, I'm again not that technical, but I can see that the possibilities could be extensive. And what you've got there is a technology that you really wouldn't want to share with your enemy, I don't think, if you have an enemy, and that you might want to bargain for on other levels, and certainly might be worth taking over a plane of people to waylay it or send it in a different direction with a purpose in mind.
And sending the First Lady to the Westin Hotel in Beijing to negotiate with the leaders of the People's Liberation Army on whatever transfer is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's also a key piece that I don't think anyone else has brought up. Kudos to you and your team for even picking up on that. I haven't seen one item about the synchronicity, which again is there are no coincidences of her being there, located there with her background, and I'm sure there are other ones that maybe we haven't heard about yet. So we've been going for quite a while here, and I think that we should stop this because I'm afraid that some of this, or maybe even all of it, is not being broadcast. Now I'm going to ask the chat here if they can reply as to whether or not any of this has been getting through at the moment, because then the next step here would be to, and certainly allowing you to decide if there was anything else you wanted to add, but would be to take questions from the audience for the next few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, if we can do that, and it's at all possible, and it looks like it should be. They're telling me the last half hour was good.
Oh, good.
But I have to say we are recording very well here. So if there are questions from the audience, would you mind addressing those?
No, I'd be delighted.
Okay, and was there any wrap-up comments that you wanted to make?
Yes, I do think it's very important, and I'm amazed at this KL02 or 03 or whatever it is, that you can swallow it, and it's got this millimeter dimension, and you point out, well, perhaps you're implying the question, how can this be used? Well, if I can get a group of people, as Serco and G4S have, where historically they've been illegally tagging, that is with an ankle bracelet, prisoners who don't exist, who are dead or back in jail or they're overseas. Well, now apparently the technology has been miniaturized, so I could either get them to swallow it or insert it in the web of their finger as an RFID device. And what that would allow me to do, if I have evil intent, is to get a team of these people at the Kuala Lumpur airport or the Kuala Lumpur hotel where these people checked in before they were going off to Beijing. Similarly in Beijing, similarly on Diego Garcia,